אמרתי, נושא איתו הרבה טייטלס, למרות שהוא מצטנע בדרך כלל. אני לא אספר לכם הרבה על מעלליו האינטלקטואלים ואחרים, אני רק אסביר לכם מה זה להצטנע. אני הכרתי את פיטר ב-1985. הוא הגיע בתור סטודנט שנה ראשונה, 84 זה היה, הוא הגיע בתור סטודנט שנה ראשונה לאוניברסיטת יל, ואני כבר הייתי בסטודנט שנה שנייה. והציגו לי את הבחור היהודי הנחמד הזה עם הטלטלים, טוב, מה אתה עושה וכן הלאה, ומתיידדים, ואמרתי לו, נו, אולי נלך לשחק טניס יום אחד, אז הוא אמר, אין לי רקטה. אז אמרתי, נו, אין לו רקטה, נבח. אני חשבתי, ראיתי את עצמי כמי שיודע לשחק טניס. השגנו לו רקטה, ובשלוש שעות הבאות אני רצתי, הפסדתי 6-0, 6-0, 6-0. ואז גיליתי שהוא אלוף ה-NCA בטניס. אחר כך אלוף פה, אלוף שם, אלוף בסטנפורד בטניס, לא ידעתי בכלל, אין לו רקטה פשוט. אז זהו פיטר ברקוביץ באמת בצמצום. מדבר מעט ברמה הזאת של להציג עצמו, ואומר הרבה בצורה עמוקה ומכובדת, ולא רק בצורה פולמית. אני חושב שמה שמאפיין את פיטר בכתיבה שלו ובכל הרמות, היא לא הנושא הפולמי, אלא הנושא העמוק של הדיון. שדיברו פעם, ואני יודע שפיטר, אני לא יודע אם אתה מצטט את וורקין חברך, אבל בנושא של ויכוחים, פיטר לא, גם בנושא עם גולדסטון, זה לא עניין של ויכוח פה פוליטיקה בישראל, אלא דיונים עמוקים לאורך זמן, שצריכים באמת להניב את התפוקה של האמת עד כמה שניתן בוויכוח פילוסופי או בוויכוח משפטי. אני חושב שאלו הם באמת הדברים המאפיינים ביותר את הכתיבה של פיטר לאורך כל השנים, במין שקדנות יוצאת דופן, כישרון באמת יוצאת דופן, ואחריות אינטלקטואלית פנטסטית, ואני מאוד מאוד שמח פיטר שהגעת לכאן היום מארצות הברית, ואנחנו הבמאי שלך. תודה רבה.
אם תרשו לי, אני אתחיל עם משפטים אחדים בעברית, אבל לא לדאוג, אני לא איש כל כך אכזרי שאני אמשיך להרצות בעברית. אבל בעברית רציתי להגיד תודה. תודה לכל האנשים ולכל הארגונים שתכננו וארגנו ומימנו את הכנס הנפלא הזה. תודה לכל המשתתפים בפאנלים ובהרצאות האחרות. תודה לדן ויינסטיין, הוא טיפל בכל מיני דברים מן הגדולים עד הפרטים הקטנים. ובעיקר, תודה רבה לפרופסור יוסי שיין ולפרופסור עזר גת. הם לא רק חוקרים מעולים, הם לא רק כותבים ספרים משמעותיים, שניהם לא רק אנשי רוח למופת, אלא גם חברים טובים וישנים. ואני מאוד מודה להם על ההזדמנות המצוינת הזאת לדון איתכם באתגר חשוב שבפניו לא רק מדינת ישראל עומדת וגם ארצות הברית עומדת, כלומר המאבק על חוקי המלחמה הבינלאומיים. עכשיו תרגעו, אני עובר לאנגלית. אני אדבר בערך חצי שעה, ועם זמן ניקח כמה שאלות. אתם מוזמנים לשאול שאלות או בעברית או באנגלית. Okay. I'll begin with some general remarks about international law and the phenomenon, what we call in English, lawfare. Talk mostly about the Goldstone Report and what it teaches us about the limits today of international law. And I'll conclude with some thoughts about, fancy word in English, the juridification of war, bishpatizatsiya shel hamilchama, lawfare and legal education. If there's time, I'll be happy to say something about also the Gaza flotilla controversy and the lawfulness, not the wisdom, but the lawfulness of an attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. Okay. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a book called Democracy in America in the 1830s. It's probably the greatest book about American democracy ever written. In that book, Tocqueville observes that American democracy displayed a tendency to transform all great political questions into legal questions, democracy displayed a tendency to transform great political questions into legal questions. When Tocqueville wrote this, he understood himself to be observing something not just about American democracy, but modern democracies in general. Built into modern democracy was a tendency to the juridification of politics, mishpatizatzia shel politika. In our age, this democratic dynamic has broadened, it's been extended. We're witnessing an increasing tendency to turn important questions of diplomacy and war into legal questions. And not just in the United States and not just in Israel, but among diplomats, journalists, and international human rights lawyers around the world, but especially in the West. At the same time, international law increasingly provides the language in which Western-trained intellectuals and political elites debate war and peace. More and more, the language of international law, whether we approve or whether we disapprove, influences public discourse and public opinion. And in a democracy, as you know, public discourse and public opinion influences the range of viable strategic options. Therefore, if we in the United States are going to explain and justify America's use of military force to a skeptical and sometimes hostile world, or you in Israel are going to explain Israel's conduct of war in a skeptical and sometimes hostile world, it's necessary to master the language of international law in general and the international laws of war in particular. My little book grew out of the work of a task force at Hoover at Stanford University on national security and law. The task force was created in the wake of the September 11th attacks in the United States and to deal with the novel and difficult legal questions that we in the United States faced. But from the beginning, our task force recognized the significance of Israel's experience in fighting terrorism. As you all know, since its birth in 1948, Israel has never known a moment when it wasn't under immediate threat of terrorist attack. No liberal democracy has faced a more sustained assault from non-state enemies than Israel, and no liberal democracy has acquired greater experience in fighting terrorism under law than Israel. Today, Israel stands on the front lines of a new kind of struggle, the struggle over the international laws of war. Israel's terrorist enemies have used the laws of war in an attempt to criminalize Israel's right to defend itself from aggression. Unfortunately, many Western diplomats, human rights lawyers, and intellectuals have collaborated, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes out of malice. The use of law as a political weapon has come to be called in English lawfare, a play on the English word warfare. Lawfare is encouraged by the reckless dream, common in the West today, that politics and war can be replaced by rational administration. Those seduced by this dream exhibit an extravagant faith in the ability of diplomats and courts of law to resolve not just disputes, but all disputes among nations. Those seduced by the dream of rational administration aim to rewrite the international laws of war to aggressively reduce the range of circumstances in which states may lawfully use military force. There's one problem with this. They tend to leave important factors out of the equation. For example, they omit or they fail to take seriously terrorists' resolve and the resolve of the rogue and authoritarian states that support them to accomplish their goals by using violence of every conceivable means against civilians. Or to come at the matter from a slightly different angle, the international laws of war as we know them today emerged over the course of hundreds of years, but especially over the last 150 years or so. The international laws of war as we know them emerged out of the noble ambition to balance two things. To balance, on the one hand, the legitimate claims of military necessity with the legitimate claims of humanitarian responsibility. Military necessity, of course, involves defeating your enemy. Humanitarian responsibility involves setting limits on the use of force, both to protect non-combatants and, in some important respects, to protect combatants. In invoking international law, critics of Israel and the United States are undermining the balance that's mandated by the international laws of war. The critics do this by focusing narrowly on the claims of humanitarian responsibility while disregarding altogether or suppressing vigorously the claims of military necessity. Now, among other things, this way of thinking overlooks nations' humanitarian responsibility to protect their own citizens. The failure to weigh military necessity is itself, the failure to weigh military necessity in understanding the international laws of war is itself a betrayal, a perversion of the international laws of war. It amounts to lawfare, the use, really the abuse, of law as a political weapon. My little book dealt with two cases that exemplify lawfare in action. The first was the Goldstone Report, published by the United Nations in September 2009. The second, the Gaza Flotilla controversy, which erupted at the end of May 2010. The legal arguments put forward to condemn Israel, both in the Goldstone Report and during the Gaza Flotilla controversy, were designed not just to condemn Israel, but to severely restrict the legitimate use of force by liberal democracies. By all liberal democracies, including the United States, and by the way, especially the United States. In my book, I criticize sharply these bad legal arguments. So I should emphasize here, my critique of the abuses of international laws of war should not be confused with the rejection or disparagement of the international laws of war. Excuse me. Both the Israeli military and the U.S. military, rightly and proudly, are devoted to upholding the international laws of war. It's likely, I make this as an empirical claim, it's likely that no armies in the history of warfare have devoted greater energy and attention and exposed their own fighters to greater risks to respect the laws of war than the armies of Israel and the United States. Now, as nation states, they bear special responsibility, of course, to protect the rights of their own citizens. As liberal democracies, they are also committed to protecting natural rights or human rights and safeguarding the dignity of all individuals. As a result, both Israel and America have a vital national security interest in their allies and their adversaries also considering themselves bound by international laws of war that seek to balance the legitimate claims of, on the one hand, military necessity, and on the other, humanitarian responsibility. Now let me turn, please, to the Goldstone Report. On April 1st, 2011, in the Washington Post, Justice Goldstone reversed himself. The Goldstone Report had been commissioned by the notorious UN Human Rights Council, an organ of the UN General Assembly. The Goldstone's official mission was to investigate the facts surrounding war crimes allegations arising out of Mivtza Yitzukah, Operation Cast Lead, Israel's December 2008, January 2009 Gaza operation. As you all know, that 3-week campaign sought to stop Hamas's firing of thousands of mortar shells, rockets, and missiles at civilian populations in Israel. Following its publication in September 2009, the 545-page Goldstone Report became the proof text for those around the world determined to denounce Israel as an outlaw nation. But on April 1st, 2011, writing for the Washington Post in his personal capacity, Goldstone withdrew. Goldstone took back his gravest charge. What was the gravest charge? The Goldstone Report's gravest charge, which it presented as a legal finding, was that Israel had deliberately adopted a strategy of humiliating, wounding, and killing civilians in Gaza and of deliberately destroying civilian infrastructure. But in the Washington Post, a year and a half later, Goldstone stated that it is now, a year and a half later, it's now well established that, I quote now from Goldstone, civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy. Civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy by Israel. That's an enormous correction. How could Justice Goldstone, a figure of international reputation, former justice of the South Africa Constitutional Court, former prosecutor of the Special International Tribunals for war crimes in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, how could he have been mistaken about such a matter? Goldstone claimed in the Washington Post that since publication of the report, new information had come to light. That was his explanation. His explanation was preposterous, ridiculous. Sure, new information had come to light in the year and a half, but there never was evidence. Certainly, no evidence was presented in the Goldstone report to support the grotesque charge that Israel had adopted a deliberate policy of killing civilians in Gaza. In fact, the Goldstone report went beyond asserting a moral equivalence between Israel and the terrorists pledged to its destruction. The Goldstone report implied that Israel was worse than Hamas. Israel was worse than Hamas since Israel was a state, since Israel used state-of-the-art weaponry, and since the death and destruction Israel supposedly deliberately inflicted on civilians in Gaza was much greater than the harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure in southern Israel caused by 8 years of Hamas bombardment. Goldstone's reconsideration in the Washington Post also silently withdrew the scurrilous accusation that Israel's legal system fell short of international standards. That's from Part 4 of the Goldstone report, paragraph 1612. This accusation is partly what justified the intervention by the international community in the form of the Goldstone mission. Goldstone noted in the Washington Post that Israel had investigated over 400 allegations of criminal conduct in Gaza. He also mentions, strangely, with apparent surprise and dismay, that Hamas had ceased to conduct even a single investigation of possible war crimes. In fact, Israel's judicial system is on a par with those of the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia, in some respects superior. Now, some distinguished Israelis, for example, Na'arech's editor Aluf Ben, Hebrew University professor Shlomo Avineri, have argued that the important lesson for Israel to learn from Goldstone's reconsideration is that Israel ought to have cooperated with the Goldstone report. They maintain that Israel should cooperate with similar international investigations in the future. They argue that even if the investigators are biased, better for Israel to make its case and get it on record before official conclusions are published and ratified by the United Nations. In my view, this is exactly the wrong lesson. Why? Israel should not acquiesce. Israel should not acquiesce to one set of rules and standards for itself and another set of rules and standards for all other nations. Israel should not cooperate in the abrogation of its rights and its responsibilities as a sovereign nation by encouraging UN investigations before Israel has completed its own. And here's a crucial point to which I'll return. Such investigations by international bodies before states have finished their own investigations, these investigations lack a foundation in international law. Under the international laws of war is written, the right and the obligation to investigate and prosecute war crimes belongs in the first place, not ultimately, but in the first place, to the nations accused. Only when a country has shown itself unwilling or unable to exercise its right and discharge its obligation, only then are international bodies authorized to pursue war crimes investigations. As I said, I'll come back to this point. Right now, to emphasize, Israel was following established procedures and in the early stages of its investigations when the Goldstone team began its. Israel was still in the process of complying with its obligations when the Goldstone report was published. So what's the right lesson to learn from the Goldstone report controversy, from Goldstone's reconsideration? The right lesson to learn is that while Israel must continue to cultivate respect for the international laws of war at home, it must also vigorously champion abroad a sound understanding of them. A good place to begin is with a critique of the Goldstone report because it embodies many common and dangerous misunderstandings about the international laws of war. Perhaps the biggest misunderstanding embodied in the Goldstone report is contained in the assumption that harm to civilians in war is on its face evidence of criminal conduct. Many people believe that Israel's Gaza operation represented an open and shut case of war crimes. I could give many examples. Here's one. In the introduction to a collection of essays published in the United States in 2011 celebrating the Goldstone report, an American journalist named Naomi Klein wrote about her visit to Gaza in the summer of 2009, 7 months or so after the end of the Gaza operation. Here's what Naomi Klein wrote. A sprawling crime scene. That is what Gaza felt like when I visited in the summer of 2009, 6 months after the Israeli attack. Evidence of criminality was everywhere. The homes and schools that lay in rubble, the walls burned pitch black by white phosphorus, the children's bodies still unhealed for lack of medical care. Terrible and terrifying pictures, but was evidence of criminality everywhere? Evidence of violence, destruction, civilian suffering, yes. But evidence of crime? Luis Moreno Ocampo, Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has written, I quote, under international humanitarian law and the Rome Statute, the death of civilians during an armed conflict, no matter how grave and regrettable, does not in itself constitute a war crime. That is, in other words, proportionate attacks against military objectives that result in civilian injury or death are legal. Proportionate attacks are legal under international laws of war. I'll come back to proportionality. Contrary to international law as written, Naomi Klein equates harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure in war with criminal conduct. She assumes that fault automatically falls against the invading army, or in this case, fault automatically falls upon the Israeli army. Not, say, on fighters dressed as civilians, taking up positions in densely populated civilian areas and aiming their weapons at civilians. But there's no foundation for Klein's equation or assumption in the international laws of war. Unfortunately, the Goldstone report encourages her false equation and false opinion. Now, as I've mentioned, the Goldstone report's gravest finding heard round the world was that the strategy guiding Israel's Gaza operation was itself unlawful. This is how the Goldstone report puts it in Part 5, paragraph 1690. Israel's in Operation Cast Lead, Israel launched, quote, a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, radically diminish its local economic capacity, both to work and to provide for itself, and to force upon it an ever-increasing sense of dependency and vulnerability. A month after he published the report, Justice Goldstone said that if this were a court of law, he was referring to the Goldstone report, there would have been nothing proven. This was an amazing thing to say. If this were a court of law, there would have been nothing proven. One of the reasons it was an amazing thing to say, because that's not at all how the Goldstone report reads or was read. The Goldstone report was read and was properly read as pronouncing Israel guilty, as in terms of legal findings of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Those findings, those legal findings, need to be rejected, and not because they're criticisms of Israel. Israel, like any state, is subject to criticism, but because the Goldstone report suffers from fundamental and fatal flaws. Let me run through very quickly 4 of these fundamental and fatal flaws. First, the report gathered and analyzed evidence improperly. On the one hand, it largely relied on the testimony of Palestinians living in Gaza, and it routinely treated that testimony as credible and reliable. But how can you credit and rely on the testimony of those who live under a regime like that of Hamas, an authoritarian regime that punishes dissent? On the other hand, the report's legal findings turned on factual findings about the intentions in battle of Israeli commanders and soldiers. But, as you all know, Israel refused to cooperate with the Goldstone report. As a result, the Goldstone report gathered no information about the intentions of Israeli commanders and soldiers. This means that Goldstone lacked information absolutely critical to performing the proper legal tests, to engaging in the proper legal analysis. Keep in mind, by the way, that under international law, Israel had no legal obligation to cooperate with the Goldstone report, and Israel had plenty of reason, amply confirmed by the Goldstone report's fundamental and fatal flaws, to suspect any undertaking initiated by the incurably compromised UN Human Rights Council. But the main point is this: without access to crucial facts about the understanding and intentions of Israeli commanders and soldiers, the legal findings of the Goldstone report are worthless. Second, fatal flaw. The Goldstone report fails to accurately characterize Hamas. The report ignores or downplays Hamas's ideology and charter, which, as you know, call for Israel's destruction. The report ignores or downplays Hamas's overall terrorist strategy, its enforced Islamization of Gaza, and it ignores the flow from Iran through the Sinai into Gaza of rockets and missiles for use against Israeli civilians. As a result, the report was incapable of properly weighing the claims of military necessity that determined Israel's strategy and tactics. Third, closely related to the first two, the Goldstone report misapplies the principles of distinction and proportionality. These are the very cornerstones of the international laws of war as regards conduct in military operations. First, the principle of distinction. It requires combatants to distinguish fighters and military objects from civilians and civilian objects. And it requires combatants to target only fighters and military objects. By the way, the principle of distinction also requires combatants to distinguish themselves from civilians. Combatants, for example, Hamas, under the international laws of war, must wear uniforms, carry arms openly, and not hide in civilian areas. As you all know, again, Israeli commanders and soldiers faced extremely difficult targeting decisions. That's because Hamas fighters flagrantly violated the principle of distinction. Now, there's a legal test to determine whether the principle of distinction has been honored. The question is whether a reasonable commander in the actual circumstances would believe that the target in question is being used to make an effective contribution to military action. But as I've mentioned, the Goldstone report failed to obtain information about the understandings and intentions of Israeli fighters. And it failed to carefully examine Hamas's systematic use of ostensibly civilian objects for military purposes. That's relevant because under the laws of war, operating in civilian areas, hiding in mosques, schools, hospitals, and apartments, causes those objects to lose their immunity. In sum, the Goldstone report disregarded or suppressed information about Hamas's intentions and conduct, and lacked information about Israeli commanders and soldiers' intentions and misunderstanding. Consequently, the Goldstone report's many legal findings that Israel failed to properly distinguish civilians and civilian objects are inherently invalid. This is not to say that in particular instances, Israeli commanders or soldiers may not have made mistakes, even committed crimes. It's possible, been investigated. What it is to say is the Goldstone report lacked evidence of this and had no basis for its legal findings. Also briefly, the principle of proportionality requires that combatants refrain from attacks in which expected harm to civilians and civilian objects will be clearly excessive in relation to anticipated military advantage. Like distinction, proportionality is highly context sensitive. It also involves reasonableness. It depends on factual findings about what fighters understood and intended, on complex assessments of tactics, strategy, and precautions, and on the soundness of instant judgments in life and death situations. Again, the Goldstone report routinely ignores such legally essential factual findings. Again, it entirely undermines its sensational legal findings. Fourth, and these are the points that in a way are the most important and the most ignored. The Goldstone report, the undertaking itself, lacked proper foundations in international law, and it lacked proper foundations. The very investigation, in two senses. First, has to do with the division of labor between the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. The Security Council has sole responsibility for security and war. In the case of the Goldstone report, the General Assembly usurped the Security Council's authority. In January 2009, in the midst of Israel's Gaza operation, the Security Council seized itself of the matter. Once the Security Council seizes itself of a matter, the General Assembly is forbidden from making recommendations, according to Article 12 of the UN Charter. Nevertheless, the General Assembly, through the UN Human Rights Council, which is an organ of the General Assembly, made many recommendations, conducted the Goldstone report, which made recommendations to the Security Council, to the International Criminal Court. There's no legal basis from doing so. In fact, it's forbidden from doing so by the UN Charter. There's a second and even more important respect in which the Goldstone report lacked proper legal foundations. International law, I mentioned this already, worth emphasizing, international law assigns primary responsibility for investigating war crimes accusations to the judicial and other relevant organs of sovereign states. I have in mind such classic provisions of international law as the UN Charter, Article 2, Section 7, Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 146, and Article 17 of the Rome Statute, the principle of complementarity. These assign to states with able and willing judicial systems the right and primary responsibility to investigate war crimes, allegations against them. The leading examples of states that are able and willing to undertake such investigations are liberal democracies. Only when a liberal democracy proves itself unable or unwilling are international bodies authorized to get involved, as, for example, in the case of Rwanda and Yugoslavia in the mid-90s. But the Goldstone report began its mission really, in a sense, even while Mitzvah Yitzukah was in motion. The Goldstone report also impaired Israel's effective exercise of its right under the international laws of war to conduct such investigations. After all, how could Israel complete an investigation that would be taken seriously after the Goldstone report had convicted it of war crimes and crimes against humanity in the International Court of Public Opinion? Now, assigning primary responsibility to states for investigating war crimes may seem like asking states to be judges in causes to which they are also a party. It is. It's nevertheless reasonable given the alternatives. Assignment by international law to states of primary responsibility for investigating war crimes is rooted in the larger liberal traditions teaching that nation-states are the best and most legitimate means of securing peace, preserving political freedom, and exercising authority over the individual. This is, of course, particularly the case for liberal democracies. The primacy accorded by international law to states is bound up with the view that states are likely to be more sober in assessing the actions of other states than our international organizations, because states must bear the burden of any proposed reform or rule. The Goldstone's report's fundamental and fatal flaws illustrate that those who are responsible for the operation of international institutions are no less subject to the passions and prejudices that thwart impartial and objective administration of law than judges and other officials in legal systems in liberal democracies. In some cases, international officials may be more subject to such passions and prejudices. The Goldstone Report is a case in point. The Goldstone Report went well beyond its official fact-finding mission, sought to advance the narrative of events and offer a vision of law aimed at limiting the capacity of liberal democracies to wage war. It did this by rewriting international humanitarian law, shifting responsibility for civilian losses away from terrorists and onto the states finding them. This shift, in gross violation of the laws of war, obscures the distinction between civilians and combatants. This shift punishes liberal democracies, which seek to uphold the distinction. Now, holding perpetrators of war crimes accountable is a worthy ambition, but it must not be allowed to obscure the obstacles to designing international institutions capable of impartially and objectively crafting, adjudicating, and enforcing the international laws of war. The obstacles to creating impartial and effective international institutions are considerable. Here are some of the obstacles. 1, the emergence of a transnational elite with interests and ambitions of its own. 2, the lack among this elite of democratic accountability and national security responsibility. 3, the domination of the General Assembly by authoritarian states. 4, the presence among the permanent members of the Security Council of veto-wielding authoritarian states. And 5, the absence in many cases of agreed-upon authority among the nations of the world for adjudicating and enforcing international law. The Goldstone Report should serve as a potent reminder that international lawyers, like other actors, have biases and blind spots, can distort facts and manipulate law, often lack the expertise in military affairs necessary to properly apply the law of armed conflict to the complex circumstances of asymmetric warfare, and operate unconstrained, again, by democratic accountability and national security responsibility. Some of those who wish to increase the role of international institutions and expand the domain of international law are idealists. They believe that international law crystallizes humanity's considered judgments about morality and war. They believe that international institutions and men and women who uphold them embody a kind of form of transnational or global governance that operates somehow above the fray of nation-state power politics. And they believe that to advance the cause of international peace and justice, critical judgments about the lawful conduct of war should be taken out of the hands of nation-states and assigned instead to international institutions. Encouragement to believe such things, to believe such utopian notions, and to brazenly rewrite international law comes from powerful trends in American universities and law schools, where, as you know, many Israeli law professors are trained. For more than a generation, professors of law and politics in the United States have been cultivating in their students a view that animates the Goldstone Report, that critical judgments about the lawful conduct of war should properly and in the first instance become the province of international institutions. That view is idealistic to a fault. It is suited to a world in which all nation-states incline to peace and govern themselves in accordance with liberal and democratic principles. Unfortunately, that's not the world in which we live, nor is it the world we can expect to emerge anytime soon. Toda rabah.
יש לנו שתי שאלות, אולי 2.5, אז מי שרוצה להתחיל בחצי, כי היום הוא ארוך ואנחנו רוצים להספיק, אז באמת שתי שאלות, כי יש עוד קהל בחוץ, אנחנו נראה מה, ואנחנו נמשיך הלאה. אז בבקשה, רק תזדהו, בבקשה. בוא רק תעמוד ותשמע.
בבקשה.
אתה בקהל מאוד נועד, אני לא בטוח איך היית זוכה למחיאות כפיים, אם במקרה היית נקלע למחלקה למדע המדינה בבאר שבע, אבל אני רוצה לשאול שאלה...
בגלל זה סוגרים.
כמובן רחב יותר. האם הדעה שאתה מציג, שאפשר בכלל להתווכח עם דוח גולדסטון, או עם מסמכים דומים, או עם תהליכים דומים, ולהצליח, היא לא קצת אוברדייטד? האם בעצם המאבק מוכרע, מי שיחליט זה לא הגורמים שרואים את עצמם, רציונליים, שאלה נפרדת, כמונו, אלא גורמים אחרים, נראה לי מצליחים יותר בשטח.
אנחנו ניקח את כל השאלות ביחד, פיטר, אז תזכור את זה. שאלה שנייה, ואחר כך חצי שאלה. כן. רק תציג את עצמך.
איך אתה מתייחס לצבא פרטי בלבנון, כאשר הוא עושה מה שבא לו? ואז השאלה שנשאלה קודם, איך מתכוננים לפני זה לאירוע שיקרה?
ועכשיו החצי שאלה.
דבורה מי?
אנחנו לא היינו יכולים לעשות את זה טוב יותר. יש לנו מזל גדול לעם ישראל שיש אנשי אקדמיה כמו פיטר שמוציאים את דיבתנו טובה.
לכן לקחנו את החצי. זה אומר שיש לך רק שתי שאלות, בוא תענה עליהן, פיטר.
So, who is the proper audience for arguments about the international laws of war? What does one do, what does a nation do with fighters who completely reject the international laws of war? First point is this. It is a fact about liberal democracies. It is a fact about the citizens of liberal democracies. It's true in the United States. It's true in Israel. True in Western Europe, although Western Europe doesn't fight in the way that Israelis are compelled to fight or Americans are compelled to fight. That we have internalized the idea of respect for the individual. We have internalized the idea of the dignity of the individual. So it's very important that we be able to persuade ourselves, because it's not true. It's not true at all that all of us, all the citizens of a liberal democracy, understand the international laws of war properly. We first need to be able to persuade ourselves. It's an internal need for us to believe that we are fighting in a way that respects our principles. We can fight in a way that respects our principles against armies that don't respect the international laws of war. The international laws of war are, in my judgment, are sufficiently flexible to recognize that when you have fighters who don't wear uniforms, who don't carry their arms openly, who attack civilians, who are not part of a recognized state army, who hide among civilians, those fighters lose immunity. They destroy the immunity of the villages in which they hide themselves. A terrible cost is to be paid, for sure. But in these cases, the balance of considerations of international laws of war permits a country, a liberal democracy, to do what it has to do to bring threats to its civilian population to an end. Now, the fight over the international laws of war, this is where I began. It really is an enormous, also, I don't only want to say propaganda battle, but it is a battle in the court of public opinion to understand these laws correctly. So, Israel internally weighs military necessity versus humanitarian obligation. But Israel and the United States too, because we are the two liberal democracies that most depend on our armies on a daily basis. Not the only liberal democracies, but no liberal democracies more. We have the greatest stake, we have the greatest interest in encouraging a proper and flexible understanding of the international laws of war in the international community. And we have no time to waste.
תודה רבה לפיטר. אנחנו פתחנו את הכנס. 10 דקות הבאות תהיו להתארגנות, רוגע לך וקפה, ואנחנו חוזרים לכאן להמשך היום. תודה רבה.